Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. In this video, I will be educating you on the topic of the Pentagon Papers. Now don't get confused, the Pentagon Papers are in fact rectangular. They get their name from the United States Department of Defense headquarters, which actually has 5 sides. Hence, the Pentagon. But the papers themselves are rectangular. They were just easier to print that way. Originally, the papers were entitled United States-Vietnam Relations 1945 through 1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense. But it became popular opinion that the name United States-Vietnam Relations 1945 through 1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense, was quite long and people grew tired saying it. So they shortened it from United States-Vietnam Relations 1945 through 1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense, to the slightly more concise Pentagon Papers, which just has a better ring to it. Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers. Pentagon. The Pentagon Papers were commissioned by Robert McNamara on June 17, 1967. The purpose of the papers was to formulate an analytical history of the U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam. The report included everything from a detailed history of the war in Vietnam to the proceedings of its resolution and statements from the U.S. presidents on justifications of the war. It even had a couple recipes. Okay, it didn't have any recipes, except for those of deceit and betrayal. In all, the papers amounted to 7,000 pages of highly informative treachery. Contrary to public statements from Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, the papers described a growing U.S. history in Vietnam and provided irrefutable evidence that Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had lied to the public about what they knew to be an unpopular war. Good thing the public didn't know about the papers. Robert McNamara himself had little involvement in the actual proceedings of the studies beyond their initial commissioning. The actual analyses were made by over 36 researchers, including Richard Holbrooke and Daniel Ellsberg. Now, Richard Holbrooke died and nobody cared, but Ellsberg was important. Ellsberg had been working on the papers for several months, when one day it dawned on him, wait a second, I forgot to brush my teeth this morning. Then the next day, while flossing, he considered the fact that the presidents had been lying for several years to citizens that trusted them, and that the papers in the possession of the Department of Defense were proof, and the people needed to know. He then devised a plan. This involved much head-scratching and rubbing his palms together. Starting in September 1969, Ellsberg began to photocopy a few pages every day. This took a lot of time because there were a lot of papers, and Ellsberg wanted to remain all sneaky-like. I also imagine a trench coat and briefcase were involved. In November, Ellsberg finished making his personal copy. Then, as part of his clever plan, he held on to the papers for over a year. Like, literally. He didn't do anything with them until January. Oh, wait, no, it was longer than that. March 1971, when he meets with New York Times writer Neil Sheehan, whom he gave the papers, and then never did anything again. And that is what makes him important, and not that Holbrooke dude that you probably forgot about. Now, Neil Sheehan was determined to keep up Ellsberg's methods of being quick to act, and so, come around June time, he was prepared to start publishing about the papers in the New York Times, beginning with the front-page article, Vietnam Archive. Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement, which revealed to the public for the first time that politicians lie. Gasps. First, it said that Truman had given aid to France knowing it would directly involve the U.S. into affairs with Vietnam. Second, that Eisenhower broke the Geneva Convention by undermining a communist regime in North Vietnam, which may sound like a good idea, but in the way of foreign policy, not so much. And that Kennedy, well, it doesn't say he did anything really bad. I mean, besides continuing to lie and stuff. Finally, Johnson, at his own discretion, instead of withdrawing from affairs when he could have, intensified the war further. Nice move, Johnny. All in all, the first New York Times article was not very flattering to the presidents, besides Nixon, which it doesn't mention at all, largely because he was not involved with the Pentagon Papers, since they and the war predated his presidency. However, he was president at the time the public had come to realize president's capacity to lie, which put him, as president, in an awkward position that to him and his administration justified a lawsuit. Nixon's administration applied a restraining order on the New York Times, forcing them to abstain from printing on the subject of the Pentagon Papers. The Times responded politely, telling Nixon that the Constitution might make more sense to him if he were to actually read what it says. Then, the Nixon administration said, "We're the government. Screw the Constitution." To which the Times firmly repeated, "You really need to read the Constitution." And with the Constitution being mentioned 3 times, the Supreme Court magically appeared to settle the debate. In the Supreme Court case held on June 30th, United States versus New York Times, the United States government posed that the Times had violated their restraining order by continuing to print on the Pentagon Papers. The Times argued that the restraining order violated their First Amendment right to freedom of press. The United States asserted that it was necessary as the information in the article posed a threat to national security, and that if they continued printing, China might invade and babies could start to explode. Despite the government's solid arguments, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the Times, and they continued printing about the Pentagon Papers. Having been bested by the New York Times, Nixon turned his focus to who he viewed to be the source of the problem, President Truman. Wait, no. Robert McNamara. No? Ellsberg? Yes, Ellsberg. That radical left-wing son of a gun with a copy machine. The guy that told the world. Yeah, that guy. Just like he brought the reality to the world that people in the government might be lying, Ellsberg brought the reality to Nixon that people in the government might try to tell the truth. And that was unacceptable. He'd do everything in his power to make sure another Ellsberg would never happen. Convinced that an army of truth-tellers might be hiding under his nose, Nixon established the White House Special Investigations Unit, codenamed the Plumbers, who were instructed to take extra-legal means to respond to possible conspiracies inside the government. The creation of the Plumbers eventually led to the Watergate scandal, which is a whole other can of worms and other types of bugs, so I'll just leave it alone. So let's recap. To start, there was an ill-advised war in Vietnam. Several presidents were involved, but we didn't know. McNamara had a bunch of dudes write 7,000 papers on it, and they were rectangular in shape. One of those dudes copied the papers and then hibernated for the winter and overslept by an extra year. Gave them to the New York Times, they wrote a few articles, government tried to stop them, and then the Supreme Court stopped them from stopping them. Nixon hired a bunch of plumbers to fix his Watergate and then got impeached. And that's everything. I'd like to thank you guys for listening. You've been great. And be sure to tune in next week for our lecture on the cellular structure of the platypus. Goodbye.